We're here today talking with Judith Ortiz Cofer from Louisville, Georgia, a faculty member at the University of Georgia. She is the Franklin and the Regents Professor of Creative Writing in our English department. She is a poet, nonfiction writer, novelist, who is well known for her works or her books of nonfiction and poetry. Silent Dancing and The Latin Deli are examples. Her novels, such as Line of the Sun and Call Me Maria, are other examples. And we're sitting here this afternoon on May 27th in the University of Georgia Library to talk about her work. So hello, Judith.
Hi, Hugh.
I wanted to ask you about your daily routine as a writer and how that might have developed over the years.
Actually, what I've tried to do is maintain the routine over the years. When I first started writing, I was at a really busy time of my life as a young mother and an instructor of English. I decided at that time that the only time that I could work was at 5 o'clock in the morning, if this is the routine you're talking about. And because no one was awake at that hour. And all that long ago, I started getting up before everyone else did and writing for 2 hours. That was all the time I had before my daughter woke up and the day began. And one of the great struggles of my life, as my life has changed, Tanya has grown up now and she's teaching herself and she's a young mother and she understands, but that is that one thing takes the place of another. So now that I have been rewarded for my work, now I don't get up to a child, but I get up to many other demands, not just the teaching, but the travel and all that. And over these many decades, I have tried to stay true to that time, minimum of 2 hours a day, at least 5 days a week. And even when I don't have anything to say, I stare at the blank page or read, and so it's I was brought up as a Catholic, and I went to convent school and Catholic school, and one of the things that they taught us was the offices. You practice your offices. You are in the religious life or whatever, and so with my writing, I try to think of it as not a work that is going to bring immediate rewards or monetary gain or whatever. It is just like the offices of a religious life. You practice it and eventually it brings other rewards. So basically that is my routine. Is I get up in the morning, I drink an entire pot of coffee in the dark, and then I head for my desk and I try to write. I wrote my novel that way, 2 pages a day, good or bad, for 4.5 years. That's how The Line of the Sun was written, and that's how everything I've written gets written.
So you're saying that you really didn't start being a writer till you were teaching English, teaching literature.
The word being is interesting because I think that being a writer is what you are. And to me, it seems that I always had a creative impulse. My mother tells me that when I was a small child, I used to force my brother and cousins into role playing. They had to be my class, they had to be the cast for my play, they had to be my tribe, and I would give them scripts. And I was probably not very popular with my bunches of cousins in Puerto Rico and all that when it was my turn to decide the game. But in school, I always, was the storyteller, and I grew up in a family of storytellers. So even though my life did not allow for me to be one of these young writers like I have in my classrooms, where at 18 they know they're going to be novelists, and they are on a path and they take the right courses and whatever. With me, I was the immigrant child and the scholarship kid. My parents just wanted me to get a degree and get a job, and I really didn't realize that I could write until I got my degrees, had a job, and understood that even though I had achieved those goals, that there was something more I needed. And to be frank with you, when people ask me, when did you realize that? I always remember writing my thesis at the library on these giant orange index cards. I was taking notes, and I would sneak off in the library and go read poetry and try to write poetry. And so I still have my thesis note cards, and on the back, really, really bad poems. So I guess I finally realized when I was getting near my goals that it was possible for me to be a practicing writer. I just didn't know how to do it.
What was the subject of your thesis?
It was Lillian Hellman's Southern Plays, of all things. I was very influenced by my professors, and I took one class where women writers were featured. That was the one class offered in graduate school, and I ran across Lillian Hellman's plays, Toys in the Attic, and that sort of thing. And my professors knew I was looking for a thesis subject, and he knew that this woman's life interested me. She was fierce. And so he said, well, why don't you read her plays and come up with something? And he knew that we had an interest in Georgia and coming back to Georgia. And he asked me to read Cash's The Mind of the South, that old book. And he challenged me. He said, why don't you take aspects of the South and try to find them in Lillian Hellman's plays? So I wrote this thesis on Lillian Hellman's, Southern plays.
I think later in her life, Hellman wrote some memoirs.
Julia and all that.
Were they influential on you?
Not at that time.
Okay.
I was really just interested in the creative process and in how a woman may become a writer. And the only models I had were like Virginia Woolf, totally unattainable. And we read a little bit of Eudora Welty, some Flannery O'Connor, and they became my early models. I know as a Latina writer, people always expect me to say that, it was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who influenced me, but I knew I couldn't write 100 Years of Solitude. But I did know that I was eventually going to have to find a way to write about an ordinary life. And Flannery O'Connor just, there was an explosion in my mind when I read her military stories, because it wasn't like the Bloomsbury Circle. I felt that in my life in the South, I had met Mrs. Turpin and I had met these people, and I said, if she can write about these things, I can write about my grandmother, and I can write about Puerto Rico and New Jersey. In other words, she taught me what I had begun to learn, like from Emily Dickinson, that you can stay in your room, look outside your window, and still find the universe out there. So
I know you read a lot. We talk about what you're reading,
yes,
and films you're watching. And
yeah.
So you just talked some about early influences on your work. And are there other influences? Do you find that when you read someone you're unfamiliar with, he or she becomes an influence?
Absolutely. When I was a young professor and a young teacher, I had to read what I had to teach because, as you know, when you start out, you're one chapter ahead of the class. And so my early poems were attempts to, in my early work, to put all of this together. I remember that I read the Odyssey and immediately had to write a bunch of poems about Penelope because she didn't have a voice in the Odyssey. And so I was directly influenced by the things I had to teach. I have a story called Nada. That is after I taught Hemingway's Clean Well Light a Place for about the 100th time. I said, boy, he sure did a lot with one word in Spanish in that story, and I have a few more than he does, and so not to try to be in a race with the great Hemingway, but so in the early part of my career, I was directly influenced by the works that I had to absorb. Later, as I gained more confidence and started reading outside the academy and outside the classroom, I started discovering that there are two ways to read. I don't know that I can practice the other way, which is to read just for pleasure anymore. I read with Post-it notes and a pencil. I just have to, because if I run across something that I can adapt, I would never say borrow or steal, but there's always new ways to do things. And so, yes, now whatever I'm reading has to be valuable to me as a writer. and it has to teach me something. An example of that was when I started attending the Breadloaf Writers Conference. I met this wonderful poet named Phil Levine, who wrote about Detroit. He wrote about working class Detroit, and so I was there with Mark Strand and Galway Cannell and Phil Levine, and most of them were writing about their Guggenheim year in Italy or whatever, and I've always had to try to place myself outside the realm of some things that I may still get a Guggenheim, I hope so, but the fact is that when I read Phil Levine's work, I understood that there was a way to write about Patterson that would bring to light certain beautiful aspects of the ugly city I had grown up in, and make it a place in my work. And so it doesn't always translate like into poetry. I wrote many stories about Patterson, but it wasn't William Carlos Williams who taught me how to write about Patterson. He lived in East Rutherford, New Jersey with the rich people. I lived in the gritty urban center. So it was Phil Levine who taught me how to write about, surviving as a person with imagination and an inner life in an urban jungle. So yes, to answer your question, everything I read right now, I immerse myself in some of the stories of Alice Munro, who's a Canadian short story writer. Her life has nothing to do with mine, but she has this ability to make the reader suspend reality and become a part of whatever life she's describing. So I'm not reading her in the same way I read Phil Levine. I'm reading her to learn how to give myself space in my writing. How do you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to write a short story, but within the space of that short story, I'm going to give myself over to these lives, So I guess, yeah, I wish I could relax and read for pleasure, But for me, reading is a very immersing and active experience. I can't read right before I go to bed because I get too excited if I run across something, and then I start taking notes, and then I can't read. So I watch a dull show on TV usually.
I want to ask you some questions about your background. You're a native of Puerto Rico. You've lived here in Georgia really for most of your life.
Yeah.
So you're a Puerto Rican writer, you're a Georgia writer, you're a Southern writer, you're an American poet, you're a woman writer. First of all, do these categories that we naturally feel inclined to force people into bother you?
They don't bother me. They sort of give me pause sometimes, and I sometimes will start my reading by even before I read somewhere, I ask them for a short podium, because I am a short Puerto Rican American Georgia Southern writer. And I always remind people that they forgot to include that category in their poster. The fact is that it depends where I'm asked to go or what book I'm in. This is an example. For example, I get sent books that include my work. Publishers, the presses send me the books, and if it's a Latino serving press or a multicultural press, I don't find myself in the index under Cofer. It's Ortiz. And so I know that the focus it's even evident by what they call me. You know what I mean? And so I don't think about categories. I try to think in terms of is this story interesting, but not just to Puerto Ricans. Is it interesting to anyone who will read it, or is this essay relevant to other people besides my ethnic group? But categories do matter, as you know. And so it was interesting. I just did a reading in Middle Georgia College in Cochran, Georgia, and the poster was a peach colored, and the announcement said Georgia writer Judith Ortiz Cofer. And then, of course, I found out that they had gotten a grant to bring a Georgia writer, so they couldn't very well put Puerto Rican writer on there, you know. So to answer your question is, these categories matter more to people, other people, than to me. However, they matter to me only in that they give me a perspective on how they see me and my work. You know, what is it that they are looking for? And what the people in Middle Georgia were looking for, yes, they knew I was Puerto Rican, but they wanted to demonstrate to their students that a Georgia writer comes in different shapes and sizes and colors, you know, which is not what they want me to do in the Bronx when I go up there. Perhaps they have a mainly Latino audience and they want to show their kids that it is possible to be Latino and be an American writer. So you see, it's the psychology of categories that's interesting to me.
So you began writing more or less after you were already here in Georgia?
No, actually, I finished graduate school in Florida, and I was writing my thesis there. So I started writing there, but I didn't get a book out for 8 years after I started writing. I mean, it took me 8 years to write enough good poems to put a collection together. It was 1987, you know, that my first book came out. And so it was soon after that we moved to Georgia. But I had been practicing the craft, it's just that nobody knew it except me. So it's like becoming a writer and being an acknowledged writer are two different things. I mean, I started publishing around the time, you know, I had been publishing in journals and all that, but books didn't, my first novel was finished here in Georgia, The Line of the Sun.
How does your background as a native Puerto Rican and an American and a Georgian inform and make up the subject matter that you write about?
Well, I mean, I don't know how to write as anything else except a woman who was born in Puerto Rico, brought to the U.S. as a child, lived my formative years until age 15 in Paterson, New Jersey, which is a different culture altogether, and then came to Georgia at a time when they were desegregating the schools. And I was, you know, I think I was the only Puerto Rican at Butler High School those years. I know there were like 2 black girls, 2 African American girls, and me. And that, of course, informs your imagination, how you see yourself in particular cultures. One of the things that I have been talking about now is that I now realize that Georgia is psychologically my home. For a long time, I wrote mainly about my life, which was basically while my father was in the Navy, we would spend half of the year in Puerto Rico while he was away on Navy tours and half in New Jersey. Then we moved to Georgia and my life changed very dramatically. And I found it much more easy to access my memories of New Jersey and Puerto Rico, you know, and to write about those worlds for a long time. And then, not that I never wrote about Georgia, I've always written about Georgia, but in recent years, a sort of different acknowledgement has of a psychological change has come over me as I near, you know, retirement in a few years and realized that our home is here. I've also realized that when I travel and people ask me, where are you from? They expect me to say Puerto Rico, because if I say Athens, they think it's Greece, you know. I have to say the home of the Georgia Bulldogs, you know, not the Parthenon. And so still, I answer Puerto Rico is where I'm from, but Georgia is my home. This is where I'm going to retire. This is where my husband is, where we have our home. And in recent years, I've been finding myself at home in Georgia, which means that when I sit down to write, I have access to the symbology of the place, to the images of the place. There's also been a demographic shift. There was a time when I was the foreign woman here, you know, in terms of people would ask me in a very friendly way, where are you from? Because I was different from most people here, or at least in the countryside where we have our farm. Now there are many Latinos here, and I find that the story of the place is changing. The narrative of Georgia is going to be a very different narrative than it has been in the past, and I'm trying to find a way to tell the story of myself and other people like me, I should say, who are here. That doesn't mean that I exclusively focus on Latinos, but I certainly, when I visit a high school and there's a little Latina girl who tells me that she's the interpreter for her family, that her family doesn't speak English and that she has to take her mother to the doctor, she has to speak for her in court or whatever, I see myself in that child. That's exactly what I did all those years ago, and I realized that whatever story I tell now will be interesting to that child now. And that's a great affirmation of what I'm trying to do.
To some extent, we've been talking about communities that you belong to, the community of Puerto Rico, the community of Southern or Georgia writers. But I've been to Louisville. I've driven through it. It's 30 or so miles from Augusta.
Right.
Some people might say it's in the middle of nowhere.
It is.
And so I'm sort of interested in whether you think of yourself as when you write, as writing as a member of a community, whichever one it may be, or as whether you feel like you're writing as an individual.
Yeah. Always as an individual. In fact, the question comes up in different situations. I have an essay in one of my books based on a question. Are you a Latina writer? If you're a Latina writer, why do you live in Georgia? Why don't you write in Spanish? You know, all of these things. And I try to answer that because when I'm in the middle of the piney woods, we have, my husband inherited land in the middle of the woods of Georgia, a beautiful, beautiful place. But when I'm sitting there, my mind goes wherever I take it to. It is not just in the piney woods of Georgia. And I write by everything that about everything that affects me. And yes, I am part of that community. I mentioned to you that I did the commencement speech at the high school where my husband teaches, Jefferson County High School. A very, very different situation from the University of Georgia or Athens. Yet I find that in speaking to those young people, I'm still addressing the same concerns as I address when I go to New York or when I speak in a school in Athens or whatever. So when I sit down to write, I don't give myself the directive, okay, you're a Puerto Rican Georgia writer, you must address these topics. I'm basically moved by what Virginia Woolf called moments of being. You know, I was mentioning to you that during the commencement speech, I was noticing how the diversity of America is always stunning to me. Here we are in Louisville, Georgia, Rennes, Georgia, and you know, I see the faculty of that school coming by, and there's my husband, who is, you know, a Georgia native and very much a part of this landscape. There's African American teachers, but there was also 5 or 6 teachers from India. They had come directly from India. Their kids speak with a Southern accent. They speak with an Indian British accent. And their children, whom I met, are, you know, Southerners, will be Southerners. And so I guess what I say to you is that if I were to write about that day, I would write about Louisville not as a place that's got such a small population, mainly made up of farmland. At one time, it represented the traditional South with its clear divisions, you know, demographic and otherwise, philosophical, political. And now it is representative of a different South, a multicultural South, you know. And so that's what interests me. What interests me was that moment when I realized that the forces of history, of change, you know, are like, you know, the floodwaters that, you know, reach with greater or lesser force, but they have a wide reach. You know, I don't know if that means something to you. I'm still trying to, as you can probably tell, get a grasp of the South in terms of what it will mean to me and to those Indian children who will be Southerners. But when you first look at them, people will say, "Where are you from?" And they'll say, "Louisville, Georgia." You know.
Do you think of yourself as an autobiographical writer?
Well, you know, when you say that, not you, but when people say, "Are you an autobiographical writer?" sometimes it makes me feel like that means that I don't have like Isaac Asimov's imagination and can't write about other planets. But the fact is that I think all of us are autobiographical writers. I think that you know, the idea that some critics practice of forgetting the author when they're reading the text is just an illusion. Yes, I am an autobiographical writer in the same way, although I'm not comparing myself to the great Flannery O'Connor, but she, you know, even more than she had lupus and she had a short life and she had to grasp every moment and every image and make art from it. I have chosen not to go elephant hunting in Africa or move to Hollywood. So I have this life plus my imagination. And so I just finished, if I may, I can only talk in terms of like what I do. I just finished a novel featuring a 15-year-old Puerto Rican girl from somewhere like Patterson whose parents are salseros. They play salsa music. All I know about salsa music is that I try to dance to it, but I immerse myself in that culture and imagine what it would be like to have two parents who have to lead a vida loca, who cannot provide security for the child, but are otherwise these celebratory people who just are not good at parenting. They're good at singing and playing music. And so my parents were nothing like that. Of course, they could dance salsa, but my father was a military man. My mother, you know, never worked outside the home and that sort of thing. So when someone reads that novel, because I have put so many elements that I'm familiar with, the music, life in the inner city, the speech, Spanglish. The novel takes place in Puerto Rico and in a northern city in the United States, and the girl has to adapt to both cultures as I did. But Doris is nothing like me otherwise. So to answer your question, yes, people who know about my life will recognize all kinds of things. I put every party I ever attended into that. I put all of the refranes, the same. My grandmother, when she can't think of something wise to say, she will say, El diablo sabe más porque es diablo than por ser diablo, which means the devil knows more, not by being old or wise, but because he's the devil. You know, and she says, eso es todo. That's all I'm going to say. So then you're left to interpret what that means, and I always had a lot of fun with that. So what I did was I bought a book on Puerto Rican refranes, and almost everything that the Puerto Rican grandmother says is one of those things. And the poor girl, who is not that great with Spanish, has to look up. And of course, I create scenes where she's totally baffled because you can't transliterate or can't translate a refrain, you know. They belong to the folklore of the people. So what I did was, of course, all of those things that are autobiographical, I threw into the novel, but Doris is not Judith, and her parents are not my parents. So does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
You write in a number of different forms. You write fiction and poetry and nonfiction, and if I'm not mistaken, the novel you were just describing would be categorized maybe as young adult fiction. And it's very rare for a writer to do all of those different things, especially combining the adult kind of fiction and poetry that you generally write with these forays into young adult fiction. How did this come to happen?
Well, I have to tell you that there was a point in my life where I made a decision that my writing was not going to belong to anyone, that what I wrote had to satisfy me as an artist. And that sounds very selfish, but it has served me very well. I think that the idea of the artist as having a career is very American. If you study the lives of like Octavio Paz or Carlos Fuentes, these people wrote in many genres, although they may be known for only one. And it's a cultural concept, you know, that basically these people believe that if you can write, you can write. And so for me, it wasn't a cultural choice. It was basically, there was a time when I wasn't in academia and for several years, and I wasn't writing for a resume. And so I basically decided, for example, I wrote 2 books of poetry, and every time I gave readings, people would tell me, you should write those stories, the stories that you tell around the poems. So one day I said, I think I'll write a novel. And you know what I did? I took my poems and I looked for images that were still haunting me. And I started my novel with images from the poems. And people will always say, I read your poems and I read your novel, and you have the same grandmother, you know, in this situation there. And I said, yeah, I plagiarized from myself, but I can't sue myself because the stuff belongs to me. And so the same thing with silent dancing. Actually, if you know silent dancing, you know that every essay is followed by a poem. Actually, the poems were written 10 years before. And what I did was I actually took the poems and I said, what story prompted this poem? And in many cases, the essay form took over, and the poem ended up only having peripheral connections to it. So to answer your question is, I satisfy the wanderings and the yearnings and the questions that I have in writing. So right now, I finished a novel, and I feel that my narrative impulse has been taken care of in terms of fiction for a while. So I'm working on a book set in the South called Peach Pit Corazon, and I plan to make it a multi-genre book of essays, stories, and poems. But what I would like to do is to have them not just be a haphazard collection, but rather have this, the Dickinson line, tell the truth but tell it slant, you know, have it reflect, the poems and stories and essays reflect different views, or at least from different angles. And what I find interesting about going from genre to genre is that they don't reveal the same thing. If I say, well, I'm going to write a poem, you know, about something I saw in Georgia, I'll start with the image, and it will lead me to a completely different place than if I started out as a prose investigation. You know, because what the essay is, the essay, el ensayo, is a rehearsal. It's a practice. You start out with a question and you go here and there, whatever. What the poem does is it focuses. It is a microscope, and the essay is a telescope. You know, and the novel is just, you know, giving yourself over to a narrative impulse. So the different genres satisfy different needs in me as a writer, basically.
Do you feel more comfortable in one of those genres than the other?
I feel drawn more to poetry, but not because it makes me comfortable, the opposite. I feel that I became an English speaker fully when I started writing poems, because the one thing I understood is that the more I spoke in English, the more vocabulary I acquired, the more I lost the Spanish, that it had to do with metaphor. It had to do with the fact that when you're creating, when you are working, and you're saying, this has to be read, and read is, and if I'm writing in Spanish, I say sangre, rosa, you know, I can think of like 5 things, and they're all cliches, you know. In English, the red brings to mind all kinds of associations, you know, and I can fully develop a metaphor. And so what I understood was that poetry was the vehicle for perfecting the language. That if I could write a poem, I could certainly write an essay, because it would give me access. I still find it hard to describe poetry without sounding as if I'm talking about a magical process. I really think that what poetry does for me, and I've heard other people say it, is that when you are immersed in a poem and trying to come to terms with the limits of language, you enter a place that is close to where you get in deep analysis. Although I've never been in deep analysis, I've read about it. It accesses parts of your brain that you can't access when you are merely reading for pleasure or writing a letter or whatever. And so I start out each day, I try to start it out by either working on a poem or reading poetry. And that for me opens up language in a way that nothing else does. And so I don't feel more comfortable in poetry, but I would say that it's the most important thing that I do as a writer.
You've mentioned how you began to work on your first novel, which I take you to mean The Line of the Sun.
That's right.
And I'd like to ask you if you would say a little bit more about how you came to write that first novel. I think it was probably, some people would regard it as a important publication for you. It brought you to the attention of a wider audience.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sad part, is that even though I love poetry immensely, poets, the joke is among poets is that you hope several other poets know that you're a poet, you know. Not many people even know who the poet laureate is, you know, and that sort of thing. So I didn't write it for that reason. I really do, and I've used this phrase before, and it's one of those phrases that is vague, but the narrative impulse is strong in me. And I think that it came about the fact that I grew up in a storytelling family. When we went to Puerto Rico, you know, we sat around my grandmother's house, and the best times that I remember, which I have documented in various essays, but mainly in Silent Dancing, was listening to these people elaborate on a story, you know, and the power that they gained from doing that. And they would actually say to each other, "Let your aunt tell it. She tells it best of all." It was, you know, the factual truth was not the point. And so I really, when I was writing the poems, I realized that I couldn't get everything I wanted to get in the poems, even though the poems revealed a lot. And so I decided that after I became aware of the fact that my life could be, you know, could be generative enough if I allowed imagination into it, you know. And so I started out with what I knew and then elaborated from that. And I realized that, you know, there were characters in my family. The central character in The Line of the Sun is named Guzman. And I had an uncle named Guzman. And so I decided, instead of starting it with me, why don't I make the girl in the novel the storyteller? And that's why the book became important to me, because you don't even know who's telling the story until you get to the second part of the novel. The first part is all Guzman. And Guzman is this big-hearted uncle, you know, who opens up her imagination. And so basically, The Line of the Sun is really about my writing philosophy, which is, you know, you start out with the familiar, the intimately familiar, and then you allow your imagination to provide you with opportunities to make a private story universal. I remember, visiting a class in Marshall, Minnesota, where everyone's name ended with son, and they were like the sun, these blonde, Viking, beautiful people. And I said, I wonder what they found to like. And remember this beautiful girl saying, I wish I could meet Guzman. And I was saying, no, you don't want to meet Guzman. First of all, he's too old for you, but basically he became a sort of Puerto Rican Byron figure to them. And they stopped caring that he was Puerto Rican. And this is how I teach multicultural literature. I tell my students, okay, we're going to read African American authors, Native American authors, Cuban, Puerto Rican, whatever. But the minute you stop thinking she's Puerto Rican, he's African American, and just think this is a couple with problems, or they remind me of my parents, we've reached the point where it's literature and not just a multicultural requirement. And then, when I came to Georgia, I started teaching and I almost gave up on the novel. I met Betty Jean Craig and made the mistake of giving her the first few chapters, and then every time she saw me after that, she says, you've got to finish this book. I need to read the next chapter. So between her and my husband, who typed every page twice or three times, they got me through the novel, and that's how The Line of the Sun was written.
Do you have a favorite among your works?
You know what Picasso said when somebody asked him what his favorite painting was?
No.
The next one.
Okay.
I mean, I like The Line of the Sun because I don't think that anyone can ever have a greater thrill than actually finishing a novel and having it published, even though there's been many books after that. I remember, well, first of all, every publisher in New York rejected it. One of them said, we like this story, but who wants to read about poor Puerto Ricans? There's just not a market for this. I still keep that letter. After it was reviewed in the New York Times and in many places, I got letters from the same people. Do you have anything like The Line of the Sun? And I said, no, Line of the Sun is done. But when I got that call from Malcolm Call at the UGA Press, they had never published an original novel before. And they said, we're going to take a chance with this. We like it that much. And it was because of the UGA Press that novel came into being.
If I were a reader totally unread in terms of your own work, what should I begin with?
Well, when people ask me what of yours should I read, I always ask them, what do you enjoy more? There are some people who just cannot get into poetry, and there are people who prefer shorter things or whatever. So if it were Hugh Ruppersberg and you asked me that, I would say read The Line of the Sun and then go to A Love Story Beginning in Spanish, my last book of poems. That would probably be it. But if for someone I meet in an airplane and I made the mistake of saying I'm a writer, you don't want to do that because everybody's got a 300-page manuscript they want to give you. But the usual thing that I say is the Latin deli, because the Latin deli is like a deli. That's the reason I called it a deli. It has a little bit of poetry, a little bit of prose,
I've been reading a number of articles lately, gloomy articles about the death of literature, the death of reading. And I wonder what your take is on these ideas.
I don't want to live in a world where there are no books and nothing to read. I cannot ever imagine it. And I think most people are reading, but we have lived long enough to see reading change, the reading. And you know that today I showed you my iPad. And I resisted electronic books for the longest time, and then Steve Jobs did this and came up with something that you can flip pages even though it's virtually, and all this. And I think I told you that every year I mail myself a box of books to Puerto Rico because after 6:30 everybody has to sit down to watch telenovelas. It's like, the law. I'm joking, but and this year I'm going to take it all in my iPad. I'm going to take my books there. And so I really think that there will always be people who read and people who don't read. There were people who read and didn't read in your childhood, right? I mean, I remember in my childhood that my mother could not go anywhere without a book, but that was not the case for every person around me. I really think that, all you have to do is look at the number of majors we have in the English department. There will always be readers, but how we read, it's just going to change. You can't have a revolution like we've been through, of the internet and all that. I really think when people say that it's as crucial in changing our habits as the Gutenberg press was, I think that it is going to be a different world. When my grandson is in college, he will be carrying around his entire library in his heavy backpack.
So how do you feel as a writer about the prospect of publishing a book rather than in physical form, in electronic form?
It's already happened. The Latin Deli is no longer taking up space in the warehouses. You have to order it online. The paper, the UGA press version of it, and so I don't feel any sense of irritation with that, because basically, if I now order a hard copy book, I have to wait a week to get it from Amazon. If I order a download, I get it immediately. And so, I don't feel that is going to change the way that I see books, except that it's going to cut down on cardboard and paper use. So, as you can tell, I'm really high on this concept today because my iPad just came in. You can ask me in a few months to see whether the experience is the same. I don't know how it will be. All I know is that just like the demographics of the United States, you cannot stem the tide. I go to the doctor now, and the nurse doesn't come in with a huge file. She comes in with a little computer, and there is my life. Decades of my health records, there. I never thought I would see that.
You've been teaching creative writing here at the University of Georgia nonstop for 17 or 18 years.
Well, I had to pay my dues and
Okay.
teach, the usual literature courses, but it's been, since the 90s,
Okay.
I have been teaching almost exclusively creative
And
writing.
you've traveled all over the country, visited other creative writing programs.
Yes.
You were visiting writer at Vanderbilt for a
Yeah.
while.
Uh-huh.
So you have a lot of familiarity with the creative writing programs at other universities, and especially at the one here. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about the place of creative writing inside the academy,
Mm-hmm.
as well as outside the academy.
Well, you asked me something about the future of books and literature and all that. If you know the demand for our classes in creative writing, you will know that not only are English majors, but there are kids in this campus, there are students in this campus in every field who are drawn to creative writing. I think that it's a human instinct, that to be creative is a good thing. And people who say I'm not creative are like people who say I don't have an inner life. And so I think that it would be a mistake to have an institution of higher learning that doesn't provide for the I don't say the education. How can you teach someone to become a writer? You can show them how to, read as writers, how to discipline themselves to be writers. I have encountered people in my classes who have been extremely talented, but I know they will never be writers because they want to have written. They don't want to get up early and write. And I have met students, who are pre-med, pre-law, in the sciences. They're all coming to my mind who are so hungry. They not only study their science, but they are voracious readers of poetry. And when they finally get to write a poem in class, it changes them. It doesn't, you know, I know their parents hope that it doesn't change them from being pre-med to being pre-broke writers, you know. But I do know one thing. There are people out there, and I have met them later in life, who have gone on to practice law. I know one guy who is a neurologist out in California, whom I met as a young writer at Bread Loaf, and he told me, my parents will not allow me to do anything else. Just now he asked me to read a book that he's done, a creative nonfiction book on treating patients with brain injuries and the stories that they tell. So he found the way to take, you know, that creativity and make it a part of his life. So I just really think it would be a mistake not to have that as a part of a liberal education, because we're not here just to teach people to be mechanics. We're here to allow them to enrich themselves and to build character. And one of the things that some of my students have told me at the end of my classes, which creative writing sounds like fun to them, and then they come into my class and realize that they're going to be writing every week, presenting to a workshop, that they're going to do more work than they've ever done before in a writing class. And they've told me at the end of the class, no, I now know that I'm not a writer, because they get to judge each other. Some emerge as natural writers, and others emerge as, you know, writers who have benefited from taking the class. I've been told that, you know, their writing has improved because they've learned poetry, and poetry teaches you that, you know, you don't waste words. And they've also learned how to read in a different way. You know, they can't just read trash anymore without seeing, you know, hearing me say, you know, that doesn't work. You know, there's too many modifiers in this sentence, you know. So I don't do anything that is different from you in teaching my classes. I teach them good writing. I teach them how to evaluate good writing. And occasionally, and almost every year, I find someone who rises as a person who will never be able to not express himself or herself creatively.
My last question to you is, what question would you ask yourself that I haven't asked?
I knew that there would be a hard one here. I guess, you know, your question could be something like, after writing for so many years, do you really feel you have anything new to say? Because that is the question I ask myself every day, you know. And my answer would be that, for me, it is a matter of the survival of, and this sounds hokey, but it is really true, the survival of my spirit. The day that I get up and I say to myself, I have nothing more to write about, I will probably take to my bed. You know, I have to find a way to use language as a vehicle for my imagination and my visions, as, you know, small as they may be. And I cannot stop myself by thinking, you know, other people are writing, you know, about different things. Like, you know, I do think in terms of like the postmodernists and the experimental, and many of my students are, you know, into things that are like MTV. When MTV first came out, I knew all the songs. You know, there was Prince, you know, there was Michael Jackson and Linda Ronstadt. Now I turn on MTV and I say, who is that? You know, but that can't stop me. It cannot stop me. I just have to keep writing. And if anybody says, well, what's the point? The point is that for whatever reason, we evolved to always think in terms of creativity in order to move the culture forward. And those of us who are writers have to believe that we are somehow part of that process, you know. And that may sound arrogant to you, but it's basically every time I write something and I send it out into the world, the last thought I have is, I wonder if this will make sense or move anyone. And then I stop thinking that way and go on to the next thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.